The last time we talked about the serial killer Edmund Kemper in part 1, you heard all about his difficult childhood, dark fantasies, and how he ended up taking the lives of his own grandparents. But after just 5 years in a state hospital, Ed was deemed ready to be released back into society. His doctors only gave one recommendation: Ed should not be put into the custody of his mother. And obviously you'd think that one strong stipulation made by the medical team treating Ed, a murderer, would be listened to. But did they listen?
Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. If you're new, welcome. I'm happy you're here. BT Dubs, you're about to be listening to part 2 of a 2-part episode, so you may want to listen to the first part first to catch up, if you haven't done that already. Just pause the episode right here and come back to it when you listen to the first part. I'll wait for you. Okay, you're back. Cool. I think we just invented a time machine together. But before we jump into part 2, make sure you are subscribed to 10-Minute Murder and connected on social media. Now, Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer. Although Ed was 21 years old at the time of his release in 1969, the troubled young man was not ready to live alone. He didn't have a job, which meant he didn't have any money, and so Ed could not support himself. The California State Authority, who was in charge of deciding where Ed would go, discussed a few different options, but in the end, they placed Ed back into the care of his mother. During her son's incarceration, Clarnell had moved to a small suburb outside of Santa Cruz, where she worked for the university as an administrator and was living pretty comfortably. Now that Ed was back under the roof, the two surprisingly got along, but only for a short while. Ed still felt like his mother was too dominating and hated that she saw him only as a loser and a failure. Ed had been able to build a sense of self-respect while at Atascadero State Hospital, but now he began to feel like he had always felt during his tumultuous childhood, like an idiot. Still motivated by the idea that maybe someday he would be able to get out of his mother's house, Ed tried to do something with his life and get a job. Conditions of his release required him to participate in secondary education, so he enrolled in a community college and began taking criminology courses. You heard me right. A double homicide in his name on the books, and he wanted to become part of law enforcement. But while Ed really worked hard and achieved good grades, his dream was shattered for a silly reason: his size. Standing 6'9" and weighing 300 pounds, Ed was denied a job as a state trooper because he was deemed too large, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but okay. The discovery was a pretty huge blow for Ed, and he'd always been kind of self-conscious about his size. He continued his search for work. Eventually, he got lucky and secured a position at the Department of Transportation, the very same place where his grandfather had worked until Ed killed him. After a few months of hard work, Ed finally had enough money to move out on his own and got an apartment in Alameda. You could say that at this point, Edmund Kemper was living a normal life, and if his mother had just left him alone, things might have turned out differently. But of course, that didn't happen, because we're talking about it now. Instead, Clarnell called her son all the time and even paid him surprise visits just to check on him. Ed, who had purposely moved over 90 minutes away from Santa Cruz, felt like no matter what he did, he would never truly get away from his mother. Constant provocation from Clarnell was one of the reasons why Ed's dark fantasies began to resurface again. He was getting angrier, and as the rage grew inside him, so grew Ed's need to kill. Because of his job, Ed drove around California and came across many women hitchhiking. Thanks to his mother, Ed was afraid of the opposite sex. But at the same time, he wanted to do something Clarnell thought he could never do. So Ed started to give rides. Quote, "At first I picked up girls just to talk to them, just to try to get acquainted with people my own age and try to strike up a friendship. Over 100 hitchhikers got to wherever they were going without an incident. But the violent thoughts were getting louder and louder inside Ed's head. Every time he saw a pretty girl, the normal side of him said, quote, 'Wow, what an attractive chick. I'd like to talk to her, date her.' Followed by the other side of wondering, quote, I wonder how her head would look on a stick. By 1972, Ed was not able to ignore his urges anymore. It was time to turn his sinister fantasies into reality. And so on May 7th, he picked up two students, 18-year-old Mary Ann Peace and 18-year-old Anita Luquesa. This was near Berkeley, California. After driving for an hour, Ed stopped at a wooded area with the intention of raping the two women before killing them. But in the end, it went another way. Ed first stabbed and choked Mary and Anita to death before taking their bodies back to his home, where he sexually assaulted their naked corpses. Then after he was done, Ed dismembered his victims and dumped the body parts in plastic bags near Loma Prieta Mountain. This was the first time Ed had escalated things since shooting his grandparents. From there, Ed kept repeating the same pattern. On September 14th, 1972, he picked up another hitchhiker, 15-year-old Aiko Koo, who had missed her bus to dance class. However, with Aiko, Ed played sick mind games, telling her that she was kidnapped, but then trying to win back her trust, saying that he had just decided that she deserved to live. Sadly, Ed Kemper was a very believable speaker, so she believed him. Even after Ed accidentally locked himself out of his car at one point, with both Aiko and his gun inside, he was able to convince her to open the door. That decision cost Aiko her life. As soon as he was back inside the vehicle, Ed choked her until she was unconscious before raping and killing her. Afterward, Aiko's dead body went through similar treatment to those before her. In 1973, he ran out of money. Ed was forced to move back with his mother. However, that didn't stop him from killing 3 more college students. One of his victims' heads, Ed even buried in his mother's backyard, facing her window as kind of a sick joke, saying Clarnell always wanted people to look up to her. As you can guess, once the mother and son were living back together again, their relationship entered a downward spiral. Ed later recalled, quote, "My mother and I started in on horrendous battles, just horrible battles, violent and vicious." It's pretty common knowledge that college students had never been Ed's primary target. While he had enjoyed what he had done to those women, he was never truly satisfied as long as his mother was alive. So on the night of April 20th, 1973, Ed waited for Clarnell to fall asleep before he snuck into her room and battered his mother to death with a claw hammer. Finally, after 25 years filled with hatred and resentment, Edmund Kemper had gotten rid of his mother for good. But he was far from done. Ed then decapitated Clarnell from her body and used her dismembered head for oral sex before placing it on a shelf and throwing darts at it. Ed also smashed his mother's face to remove her tongue and larynx and threw them into the garbage disposal. It wasn't strong enough to chew up the parts completely, so the disposal spit it back into the sink. After that, Ed sat down and thought about the situation he had created. He quickly realized that Clarnell's murder was going to point directly to him, so Ed needed to cover up the real motive behind the murder. In order to do that, Ed invited his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, over to the house on Clarnell's behalf. When Sally then arrived at the house, he strangled her to death and decapitated her corpse. In his mind, Ed thought that both Clarnell and Sally's murders now looked more like an intruder had committed them. As smart as Edmund Kemper was, he really made some pretty stupid decisions. Ed took Sally's car the following day and then fled the town. He drove all the way to Colorado while carefully listening to the radio, as Ed was sure he would soon hear about the news of the double murder. But he was wrong. There was no mention of Clarnell and Sally's deaths, because nobody had yet made the discovery, and for whatever reason, that annoyed Ed. On top of that, Ed quickly realized that he was indeed running, but he had nowhere to go. Just like Ed Kemper had felt lost after killing his grandparents years earlier, he once again didn't know what to do. Back in 1964, Ed had called his mother for help, but because she was no longer alive, he called the Santa Cruz Police Department. Nobody believed him at first. After all, Ed had been a regular sight at a bar called the Jury Room, which was popular with the police officers for a long time. Big Ed, as they called him, made friends with the local cops, who now find it difficult to accept that he was actually a serial killer. But as Ed began to tell details that only the so-called co-ed killer could have known, they didn't have any other choice but to take him seriously. Soon enough, Ed was picked up by the police from the phone booth that he'd used to turn himself in. When asked why he had decided to turn himself in and stop killing, Ed said, quote, "It wasn't serving any physical or real emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. On May 7th, 1973, Ed Kemper was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. There's not really any doubt if he was guilty or not. After all, Ed had given a very detailed, explicit confession to the police. However, Ed still pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, the only possible option his defense had at this point. However, during the trial, which started on October 23rd, the idea of insanity was quickly rejected because Ed appeared to have known that what he did was wrong, and there was evidence of premeditation. After he was found guilty of all 8 counts, Ed requested the death penalty. He'd already tried to kill himself twice while awaiting trial, but with capital punishment suspended at the time, Ed could not get what he asked for. Instead, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Since then, Edmund Kemper has been incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Solano County. His parole has been denied multiple times, but even Ed himself says that he should remain in prison for the rest of his life. Quote, "I think I could handle parole, but I believe wholeheartedly that society is not ready for any shape or form of me. I can't fault them for that." And obviously a lot of people agree with that statement. Ed was released once, which resulted in altogether 10 people losing their lives instead of just 2. Most likely, Edmund Kemper, who is now 73 years old, will not get another chance in life. That's today's 10-Minute Murder. Brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for listening as we wrap up the last part of Ed Kemper. Before you scoot out of here to get back to your normal life, ask yourself if you know anyone in your life that is into true crime stories. Then shoot them over a link or just a suggestion to check out 10-Minute Murder. That's the best and quickest way if you want to help me in my little old podcast here. I'd love for this thing to grow even more than we did last year. It grew quite a bit last year, and so it's a pretty lofty goal. But if you shoot for the stars, even if you miss, you end up floating around space, alone and cold, without air or Skittles. All right, that's probably not how that saying goes. Anyway, subscribe wherever you're listening right now and connect on social media. Links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening to 10-Minute Murder. Be safe and have a good night.